Okay, we're going to cover the human biology research papers, which involves going back to the page we were on. So, human biology, or profmcdarby.com, all sessions, down the page. Research papers. This is papers where you do the research, and then you tell me in your own words, doing as little dropping quotes as you can get away with, because I want to know that you understand it. And if you fill up a paper with quotes, I don't know whether you really understand the material or not. So you can use them if you absolutely have to, but sparingly. From where you start writing to where you stop writing, there should be 4 pages of text. So I don't mean 4 pieces of paper. I mean 4 pages from beginning to end. And normally margined and normally spaced, because if you get 3.5 pages and tell your computer to expand that to 4 pages, which some of you know how to do, it pulls the margins in and opens the spaces up into an unreasonable amount. And here's a weird thing. The deduction for unreasonable margins and spacing is the same deduction you get for not getting to 4 pages. So, 4 pages, not that much. It doesn't take that much writing to get to 4 pages. Needs to be proofread. I'm a visual learner, which means I'm a good speller. It's the only reason people can spell well is their brains work with vision. I know what words look like, but I can't not see them. I have the same issue with grammar, so you need to get it right, which is a good thing to train, is that you don't know how many people may look at your cover letter or your resume and after the 3rd error are just dumping it because they go, well, if they haven't bothered to do this right, why am I going to bring them in for an interview? And that's the thing. I'm not going to expect you to do that on exams where it's a quick turnover, but you got a month to do these papers. So if you know you're not a great speller and you don't necessarily do grammar well, you got a month to get it right. And the library has a writing center that you can access. I don't know exactly how, but they do. You can contact the library. But you can also do them early, and I will pre-correct them for you, and I'll do something the library won't. I'll tell you if you're doing it right. Is I won't just tell you whether your spelling and grammar is okay, but I'll tell you, yeah, okay, no, you need to expand this more, you need to explain this, you need to put this in jargon like you were writing for just a person and not for me. You know, all sorts of things I'll tell you. But here's what people very often ask me. Is there extra credit? And my answer is, yeah. Make sure it's right before you hand it in. For a paper, do it early. Get it pre-corrected, fix it. Maybe get it pre-corrected again and fix that. That's a little bit of extra work, but it will give you a much better mark, and so there's your extra credit points. You can do that with labs too. Is that if before you stick hand a lab in, if you go, does this look right to you? Is this what you wanted as an answer for this question? Is that I'll go, no, you're way off on this, and I'll send you back to your table to kind of brainstorm with people. And but eventually, if you go, we can't figure out what this is, I'll get you to the right answer. But you got to ask. Is that this is basically the way that the course runs. I will help you as much as you let me help you, but I'm not going to chase you around. There are rules against that, right? You need at least 4 proper references. These are references from reliable sources that have some meat to them, that are meant for a college level audience. So encyclopedias, which are written for high schoolers, not a proper reference. Dictionaries, if you need to define a word, then the dictionary that you use has got to go in your reference list, but it doesn't count as one of the 4. But you can use stuff out of the library's databases. They have lots and lots of articles off the library's databases. We'll do a lab about that, I think. I think we got that this semester. And you can use internet sources provided you determine that they're a reliable source, which we'll also cover in that lab, but basically amounts to, you should always know about an internet source is who's responsible for this information, And why should you trust that they know what they're talking about? Is that you can find on my website that I'm a college biology professor, which means that you should be able to trust the stuff that's biology related that's on my website. Organizations, see who's in the organization. Is that can be tricky, because most organizations, when you're doing like human biology, medical research, I have like doctors and stuff doing things. But some of them are just a bunch of parents got together and threw up an informational website, and who knows if they know what they're talking about or not. They don't, on paper, have the background to make them trustworthy. So that's, you've got to have trustworthy sources. You need something relatively new as well. Now, one thing that we do, I don't have you do this in little steps where I check every step, but I do want you to give me a proposal. A proposal is a very simple piece of work. It can even be, it doesn't even have to be typed, it can be handwritten. I want three things. I want to know, you got a list of topics that we'll go through. They have numbers. You can tell me the number, you can tell me the topic. I will expect the topic number on the paper as well, on your title, so that I know somewhat what to expect. But I want your topic. The topics are very general. You need a subject that will work for that topic. So I need your subject. I'm gonna do a case history of somebody. Great, they had diabetes, that's the subject, or they had this condition or that condition. And third, I need you to show me you've already started looking and that you've got a couple of references that maybe you'll wind up using and maybe you won't, but they're actually honest to goodness references. So I got the American Diabetes Association. I've got this person that I've got to interview and they're gonna take me through their case history. That's, Google is not a specific reference. I'm gonna use Google, that doesn't tell me anything. I'm going to the library, that doesn't tell me anything. But I found this, I found that. Now, when you put these on your papers, these references, they're gonna have to be a very particular format. For the proposals, as long as it's pretty obvious you got something specific. If you went using the American Diabetes Association website and the Mayo Clinic website, great. You don't need to give me all the other details you'll need to put on the paper. But topic, subject, couple of references, you're golden on the proposals. And then I'll take a look and usually send you a proposal back going, yeah, this looks fine. But sometimes it'll be, I don't think you can find enough information on this topic to get 4 pages out of, or remember you've got to do this if you're doing this topic, remember you got to do that if you're doing that topic, kind of remind people and I'll do that as I go through the topics in a couple of minutes. To give you the same reminders I'll throw on the proposals usually. But you send it in, I give you comments and you get it back. It doesn't count for much, but it keeps you from going into the weeds immediately and being, starting and working on the wrong thing and then giving me a paper that just isn't what it's supposed to be. I already talked about proofreading. If you kind of keep me in your informational loop, say you want to, people sometimes pick interviews, and sometimes they have trouble pinning the person down to do the interviews. And they go, wow, I've got this great person, and we set up to do the interview and they were too busy, they were on call, they were, whatever. And you just keep telling me that you're having this problem or you're having that problem. What that tells me is you're working. You're trying to get the paper pulled together. And then if we hit the deadline and you go, I haven't been able to pull it all together yet, I'm very inclined to go, okay, take an extra week. But if we hit the deadline and you come to me with an excuse and I haven't heard anything before, what I'm thinking in my little head is, you just started this last night and you can't do it in a night. I'm not giving you an extension on that. So keep me in the loop. Is it your chances of getting it? Now you can turn stuff in late. You can turn anything in late. We talked about that in the other video. It just loses points for being late day by day by day. But if I give you an extension, your deadline now has been moved and then it's late after the extension deadline. You can give me a title page if you want. If you put your title on the page, it would be nice if you gave it a little bit of room. It should be pretty specific. I should know what I'm about to read. A case history doesn't tell me anything. Case history of someone with diabetes tells me something. And I want the topic number as well, so that I know, okay, what topic, because memorize your proposals. And so a month's gone by, I don't remember what your topic was supposed to be. And you'd be amazed how often they don't put a topic number down. They didn't give me a proposal. And I'm all the way through the paper and have no idea. It doesn't match any of the topics. And sometimes that's because they totally forgot there was such a thing and they just kind of wrote a paper about something to do with human biology. But sometimes they meant it to be a topic and they're just so far off it that I couldn't recognize it. Or it's a combination of two topics at the same time, which you're not supposed to do. So when you put your title down, just give me something readable and the topic number. When you write your text, from where you start to where you end should be 4 pages. That's the first thing I do, is I put my hand on the page and then I flip, I put my hand, I flip, I put my hand, I flip, I put my hand, and there should be text at or below the 4-page mark. Better to go past. Better not to go short. Because it's an easy, I'm putting deductions down off of the list that's on the end of this. And so that's the very first thing I'm looking for. Well, actually, the first thing I'm looking for is whether the topic number is there. That's a deduction if you leave that off. And then the footnotes, we're lying. People who do science papers, we call them footnotes, but they aren't actually footnotes. But I'm going to call them that because that's what we do. They're technically what's known as embedded notes. So you don't put a number and a number at the bottom of the page in the reference the way that you might on an English paper. What you do is you refer to your reference list. Is that you have a quote. Here's my footnote. If you go to the reference list, you'll see what this refers to. How do I know? Well, because I put the last name of the person on the reference list, the first person there, your reference is alphabetical. So I read, you give me a direct quote, and then it says Adams in parentheses. I go, oh, that's got to be early on the reference list because the reference list is alphabetical. I do your reference. Yeah, sure. The first reference is Adams, somebody, and maybe a bunch of other people, but you just put the first person on there unless you've got a couple from the same person, and then there's other tricky things you do to point to which reference it is. But I don't care about the page number. I don't care about the first name unless you've got 2 Adamses, and that's the way you're going to tell me the difference. But this is how science people do their footnotes. And what do you got a footnote? Well, anything really where a reader would go, we had to have gotten that from somewhere specific. Direct quote, you had to have copied from somewhere. Numbers, you had to copy from somewhere. Other things that should be footnoted, I won't generally deduct for. I'll put a little note saying that really should have a footnote on it. But you don't put a footnote on a direct quote, that's a problem. You don't put a footnote on numbers, that's a deduction problem. So, and then you do the footnotes this particular way. And I always check your reference list to make sure that that footnote actually corresponds to something on your reference list. When you do the reference page, we're also using a science format here. The tricky thing is there isn't a set science format, but what it does amount to is who did it, how old is it, what was it, and where'd you find it. Simple order. What does vary, if you're writing science papers, every journal says, well, okay, this has got to be a semicolon, this has got to be a comma, and this has got to be a dash. I don't do any of that. I just want it, I want people, last name first, as many of them as you got, year, because age of science, it goes, something from 2019 is more up to date, obviously, than something from 2000. But we're not so anal, we want the month, we just want the year. And then, what was it? Magazine article, give me the name. Website, give me the page name, which is up in the little tab, up at the top, that's the page name. And then, what was it part of? An article came out of a magazine or out of a newspaper or out of some sort of source. There's the databases to give you that. A web page is always this is part of my website, which used to be part of the FMCC website. So you could either give my website name, which you have to do now because there's nothing above me, or under the old system, you could have given my site or FMCC, because like Russian doll sort of thing, is that you very often will have sites that are part of a government site or part of a university site or a hospital site. And the way to get to that is to go to banners, peel the address back to the first slash, go down and look at the copyrights. There's all sorts of ways of finding what you're in when you're on a web page to be as part of being part of a site. Almost always tells you. And if you're not sure, just ask me and I'll figure it out for you. And then the specifics. If it was a magazine article and it's out of a magazine, how do I track that down? I need the volume and issue numbers and pages, so you would need to give me that. If you got it out of a specific database, there's a bunch of databases you could use from the library. I want to know what database I got to go hunting into to find that particular magazine article, because putting it into the general system doesn't often work. So I know you got out of this database or that database if you use the library. And that's generally how you're accessing articles now, especially in a coronavirus pandemic, but even before. If it's a newspaper, you put the dates down because that's how you track down newspapers. If you're using a book, the publisher for the book, page numbers, if it's got specific page numbers and databases there. And I already covered the internet sources, which the author for the internet source is very rarely a human being. The author is almost always an organization of some, like the American Diabetes Association or the Mayo Clinic. So there's usually not a person. But if there is a person, they go up there, but typically that's going to wind up being an organization. Also, on the internet, I want to know when you looked at this last, because unlike paper sources, the internet sources do change. And so what you saw may not be what I'm going to see if I go and look, sometimes for good reason. Now, one nice thing about footnoting is it gives you somebody to blame. Here's an example. A number of years ago, student was doing a paper on diabetes. I forget which topic it was. There's a couple of different topics that you can do on diabetes, but at some point she explained how insulin works. And I'm reading and I go, that isn't how insulin works. But she had an American Diabetes Association webpage that she had as a footnote. So American Diabetes Association in the parentheses, I went to the reference, it told me what page it was from, which was like basics of diabetes or something. And I went there, it was wrong. Is that I kind of understand that they were trying to simplify the for a general audience, but they simplified to the point where they were totally lying. Insulin doesn't tell cells, doesn't tell cells in your body to take up sugar. It tells just a few populations of cells in your body to store the sugar away for later. That's a pretty important distinction. And the reason I'm telling the story here is I didn't count off on her for telling me the wrong information, because it was information she got from a reliable source. And so she blamed them and they were wrong, that's fine. I sent an email to the American Diabetes Association. This is not what you should have up on that webpage. It's misleading, it's not right. And if you were to go and look at that page now, it's right now. They changed stuff. So that's why I need the date that you looked at something. Is if what you say and what they say doesn't go together, I can get into there's a Wayback Machine. You can look at old versions of web pages to see if maybe the information was different when you looked at it. Because that happens too. People write down what they think the stuff says and they get it wrong. And then I go and look and the source is right, but they're wrong. That's the more typical thing. If you're doing an interview, how you write the person down for the interview. If you're using a pamphlet, is that there's all sorts of weird sources you could use. Let me know, we'll figure out. There's ways to write them into a reference list. Rest of this is mostly topics. Here's the topics you can use. Remember, they got numbers. A human health crisis. Gee, that's hard to think of an example for, is that the pandemic is a human health crisis. I don't know I don't think if you wanted to do that, my response would be, this is gonna go way over 4 pages. It's just so much information that maybe you could pick a little bit and piece of it. But the idea is, the media gets, they get really excited about stuff and they tell you things. And if you go and you check more reasoned, more scientific, more reliable sources, you often find that the media is either not understanding something or they're exaggerating for effect, because they would want you to keep watching their shows. Is that there's a reason why the news channels right now are getting great ratings, because people are scared and they want to check information. But the general information right now is you can't trust immunity to COVID. That we don't know, it may wear off after a couple of months because the antibody levels drop. That's from a couple of studies, the antibody levels drop. And so that's being reported in the news media as we don't know. But if you actually go and you check, that would be a tricky one. If you go into reliable sources, you'll get a couple of different stories. Is that there's a lot of government-related sources that basically amount to, we don't want to tell you anything specific, and we don't want to promise anything, so we're going to say we don't trust that the immunity will last. If you go to other sources, you go, yeah, antibodies don't tell the story, is that it's not a trustworthy source of whether your immunity is going to lag or not. We have these other things that say the immunity's fine for a good long time. And the people making the vaccines obviously believe it's going to work. So you tell me what the media is talking about, give me some media sources, and then go and find some reliable sources and see how well they go together. Did the media get it right? Did they exaggerate? Did they not exaggerate? Did they get stuff wrong? And there have been other human health crises. A few years ago it was Ebola. Is that it's bad water. You can find a lot of things that the media has kind of pumped up as a health crisis over the last few years. But it's a little tricky. They don't do it that much. Right now they don't really have any. They gotta. It's a pandemic. Number two, ethical issue. A human health-related ethical issue. Something where some people think that it's right to do it that way and some people think it's wrong to do it that way. Right now, I don't think you can get 4 pages on this, but an example is what they call challenge trials. Is that if we develop a vaccine, how do you find out whether it works or not? And some people go, well, you give it to people and then you expose them to the disease and see if they get the disease. Well, some folks think, no, this is a potentially deadly disease. You don't do that. But some people go, oh, well, if you do it with the right people who aren't likely to die from it anyway, it should be fine. And then the science side of that is, well, yeah, but it's, we're really worried about protecting the people who might die from it, so we don't even know if that's a legitimate challenge. But that's an ethical issue. And right now I told you pretty much all the sides of it, so it'd be tough to get 4 pages on that. But there's lots of human health issues that have ethical, this side, that side, this side, that's sometimes 2 sides, sometimes 12 sides. And your job is to give me all the sides. If you got an opinion, you can give it, but don't throw the paper all to the side of whatever you feel. Is to give all the sides fairly. One thing I do ask people to do is don't use a source that itself has written your paper for you, that's a pro-con, gives all sides. I want your sources to come from different sides of the question. And those are not that difficult to find. Health technology is that new developments in health technology. Here's something from the pandemic that maybe you could do, although it'd be a little tricky because I don't know that you've got the science background to do it. But vaccines. Right now, there are at least 4 baseline different approaches to vaccines that are in play right now that people are trying to develop. And then there's variations on that all across the board because it's like 20 different vaccine trials at least going on. So you could talk about how vaccines are made and pick one and then compare it to what the other ones are and give a little bit of background about vaccine technology. And but as I said, vaccines would overwhelm you, I think, because you're talking about messenger RNA and adenoviral vectors, and there's a lot of stuff that you would need to train yourself about. But that'd be good because then you'd be able to put it in your own words and show me that you really learned stuff from it. That's kind of what the papers are for. But there's other types of health technologies out there. A lot of people have health technology in their lives, and so they want to write a paper about that. That's fine. One warning: pick something that's actually in use. Is that there are pie-in-the-sky health technologies that are in development that may or may not ever turn out to be useful. But your sources are all going to be very biased toward, you're going to either find sources from the company that's developing it or people that somehow are invested in it. It's like, oh, this is going to be wonderful. It's going to be the best thing since sliced bread. And that's not, you want something to have been out there so that it's got an upside and a downside and more to talk about in terms of how it really gets used in the real world as a practical application. This one kind of works the same way. New developments of a particular type of health-oriented research. But the tricky part of this is, I want you to dig in and tell me how that research is being done. Like if I were to tell you about lasting immunity, is that I would talk about these different studies and what they looked at and how they did those tests to figure out what they had. And then I could talk about how this result doesn't match that result because they were looking at antibodies, and they're looking at CD8 cells, and they're looking at memory T cells, and I could compare how one or the other is maybe a better measure of immunity, whether the time frames work. But it's really kind of a nuts and bolts, this is how research is getting done kind of paper. And it can be very, very interesting, but it also can be overwhelming for people, somebody with a very shallow science background. But you can do an interview with a health professional. This one sounds easy, but it turns out to be one of the most difficult ones to do. The interview's easy. You sit them down, you find out why they went into this profession, what their training was, what their early jobs were, what their tasks, what their job is now. That's the simple part. The tricky part is, I want them in context for their profession. So once you start talking about training, say you got a friend who's a nurse. They went to FMCC's nursing school. How typical is that? Is that the only way to become a nurse, is to go through a 2-year program at a community college? Well, it turns out it's not. There's a bunch of different options that amount to nurses training. So you're going to tell me how typical their training is and what else is out there as options. They came out of nursing school and their first job was this. Well, is that usually what nurses right out of nursing school do? Or is there a typical first job that they just didn't wind up in? So tracking that information, what the typical arc is for a profession, can be very difficult stuff to track down. The one advantage you do have is a lot of times your interview subject knows where to find that kind of information because they're interested in their own profession. Like, what are other people making? Who's getting unionized? Is it they have some sources that they can point you to that may be able to put them in context. But basically, every step of the way, other than why they decided to go into it in the first place, you want to take what happened to them and compare it to the broader picture of their profession in general. If they're a supervisor, how typical is somebody after X number of years to be a supervisor in their particular profession? Is what they do typical for what supervisors do in that particular profession? Tricky stuff to find out. Is that be very interesting for your interview subject, whatever you do find out. And if you're really interested in what their job and you're thinking about that long term, it's going to be good for you to know too. But it's a difficult paper to do. The next one's kind of similar. You're not interviewing, but you're telling me about a business that's in the health field. How does it all work? And the tricky part here is, and this is not as tricky as it is up here, is to tell me how they work, but kind of compare them to what a typical business, what other businesses doing the same thing are. Like if you wanted to do an urgent care center, how does an urgent care center compare to a primary physician's office or to an emergency room? So most of your paper is going to be about your business that you've chosen to talk about. This is how the urgent care business got started, or who runs it and what they do and stuff. But at some point you're going to go, this does not work the way that that a primary care physician would work, and this is the differences or the similarities. Same thing with an emergency room. What can they do? What can an emergency room do that the urgent care center can't? What can the urgent center maybe do better than an emergency room can. So a lot of those comparisons are kind of across the business, or the businesses for that. But as I said, that's not usually as tricky to find out. A lot of diseases have a particular history. We're in a coronavirus pandemic. The history there goes back to about last August, about a year back, and that's it. And nobody's really sorted through the history yet. So that would be a terrible subject for this particular history. Something like influenza, I don't know how easy it would be to put a history together for influenza. I know some people have written books on it. But influenza has a much deeper history, and a lot of different strains of influenza, including the Spanish flu 100 years ago. So you might be able to put together, if you can find the sources, history of influenza. But there are a number of conditions and diseases that have histories. We go, this is what happened now, and then later they found out this. Stuff like, and some stuff would be really overwhelming if you wanted to do the history of autism as a condition, is that there's a bunch of stuff they've discovered, a lot of which I'm expecting you to find and have in your paper, because I know about the history of a lot of these conditions, because that's the way that my system, my mind works. I look at things through a historical perspective. So some things it could be, but if you're really interested in it and you want to wind up writing a 12-page paper and you get all the things really well, and it's, I don't feel like it's making my head explode trying to read it, I'm fine with you going over on things. So if you pick a subject that's really expansive and you want to write a really expansive paper in order to cover everything, that is fine. But it should follow a timeline. Is that it's really annoying for me when I'm reading and it's like, okay, here we are in the 1930s. Here we are in the 1990s. Now we're back in the 1950s. Now, I don't know when the heck this happened, because they haven't really pinned it to a particular time. So the same way anybody would be doing a history, go in chronological order when you're putting stuff together. The last one is actually, again, something that seems simpler, but it's actually more difficult, and that is to pick two books that basically are on the same thing. If you propose this, I always give you the same response. I need to look at the two books, because I want to look at the tables of content, say, side by side, and they should look like they're pretty much covering the same stuff. Because your job isn't to tell me about the content specifically. Like say you had two books on autism, and I looked at them side by side, and they look like they covered the same stuff. Your job is to compare and contrast, because they're not going to cover the same stuff. One of them may spend a heck of a lot more time on the history than the other one does. One of them may talk about Asperger's, and it barely gets mentioned in the other book. Is that there's going to be ways that you can compare and contrast how the book, are they written for the same audience? Are they organized the same way? Does one have a lot of pictures and the other one doesn't have a lot of pictures? But it's going to be less about the subject of the book and more about how the two books compare to one another, even though on the surface they kind of look the same. And that's something to talk about too. You can go, oh, they did this chapter on this guy, and the other book did the chapter on the guy, and they're like the same chapter. But you got to read two whole books. You only need two references, but you got to read two whole books. And they got to be pretty decent books, because you run out of stuff to compare if you compare two little bitty books. So it's doable, but it's tricky. Sorry. So those are the topics. Then it's just things like mistakes people make, spelling and grammar errors, and then the list that I use in order to do my marks, so that I get consistent for my deductions. Oh, they made this problem. How much is that off? Oh, okay, it's off of this. And the deductions for a lot of stuff does get higher for the second paper, because I figured, okay, you shouldn't be making the same mistakes on the second paper. I think that covers everything. I know it covers everything here. Is if you have any questions, I'm a phone call or an email away. And the proposals, the first proposal is due the 14th. So the Monday, a week after Labor Day, the first proposals are due. They can, should be submitted into Dropbox, because if something isn't submitted into Dropbox, then I can't put the marks into the system. but I would much prefer to get a physical copy that I can mark and hand back to you, as opposed to a Dropbox. That's gonna be true through the whole semester. That at some point, you can just drop a blank sheet into Dropbox for something that we did in the lab that we've got actually physical copies of that you handed to me. But at some point, I need something deposited on your end into Dropbox so that I can then put your mark into the Blackboard grading system. It's annoying, but that's the way we gotta do it.